The life of a servant in the Victorian era was a world of hidden hardship and unseen devotion. We often see images of these people working quietly in the background, tending to the needs of the rich and famous, but we rarely think about what goes on behind the scenes. Victorian England was a time of profound social differences. Society was strictly divided into classes, and servants occupied a special place in this hierarchical order. For most servants, life was not only work, but also a complex game with rules, where a mistake or carelessness could cost them their job or even their freedom. In Victorian England, everything was organized according to a strict class system. At one end were the upper crust of society, the aristocrats, gentry, and wealthy industrialists who enjoyed luxury. At the other end, in the shadow of their grandeur, lived the servants. Their lives were not just work, but a real challenge, and if you were in their shoes, you would not have enough words to describe how difficult it was to be invisible to everyone, but at the same time essential to the work of the house. But what happened in these invisible worlds? We tend to think of servants as shadows, but they were much more than just working hands. Every day they faced difficult challenges, from invisible expectations to constant tests of their loyalty and fidelity to their masters. Their work was unnoticed, but without it there would be neither the luxury seen in a rich man's home nor the order they maintained. For example, Jane, a young servant, began her day at 5 a.m. Before the stars had even disappeared from the sky, she could have gotten a good night's sleep like anyone else, but her life was different. At 5 a.m., when the house was still silent, she had to tidy the master bedrooms, make sure there were fresh flowers everywhere, and prepare breakfast. Her only duty was to work. Every morning was like the previous one, but each time Jane felt more and more like her life was slipping away into emptiness. But Jane was not alone. There were many other servants in the house, and each of them, though part of the machine, remained in his role. Mr. Holloway, an old footman who had served in this house for decades, was obliged not only to open and close doors, but also to act as a confidant of the masters. He knew all their secrets, although he could never reveal them to anyone. The service was not only in being useful, but also in being a silent keeper of other people's secrets. But, as is often the case, things are not as simple as they seem at first glance. The emotional burden that servants bear often remains invisible. They see how rich homes are filled with life. Lavish dinners, expensive fabrics, guests, laughter, and business talk. They hear laughter and enthusiastic comments, but they themselves cannot be part of this life. The life of a servant is like a shadow that follows every move of the masters, but remains invisible to everyone. One day, Jane noticed something strange. At one of the dinners, while her eyes were trying to nestle on the small pieces of hors d'oeuvres that she was serving to the hosts, she saw how Lady Eliza, the host's wife, lost control of her emotions. A few moments, and Eliza, in front of everyone, blushed and cringed when one of the guests, inadvertently breaking away from the general conversation, said something that was not to her taste. At that moment Jane understood. Even in the richest houses, where everything seems perfect, their weaknesses and discontents are hidden. This awareness shocked her, but she knew that she was not allowed to discuss such things. It was then that Jane began to notice that servants often remained invisible not only to their masters, but to themselves. They could not allow themselves to stop, to experience any personal pain or tears. They had to maintain the appearance of perfection and devotion, but what if they still could not? What if they began to doubt their role, their place in this vast, seemingly perfect world? Soon Jane met another maid, Amelia, who had been working in the house for several years. Amelia was older, with eyes full of life that had weathered the storm, but always remained in place. Amelia told Jane that she had witnessed many situations where servants tried to change their fate. It happened rarely, but such cases were remembered forever. Several times she saw how maids got into awkward situations with their masters, which led to the destruction of their lives and careers. With each passing day, Jane began to feel more and more that her life was about more than just following orders. She began to wonder about what was going on behind closed doors, about what was really going on behind that aura of luxury, and although her duty was to maintain order and be the shadow of her masters, her mind couldn't help but question the system she found herself in. But what happened next? This was only the first step to understanding what the life of a servant was really like. Jane was just beginning to realize that, despite the hard work, she could become more than just part of the background. Her eyes were opening, and with them came questions she could not find answers to. Why was there no room for real freedom in her life? Why was she, like all the other servants, forced to live in such conditions? While Jane and Amelia were talking in a dark corner of the kitchen, another servant, an old butler named George, was watching them. He knew that these conversations were not just discontent. This was the beginning of a change. He himself was too old to change his life, but his heart still beat for justice. He knew that there would come a time for Jane and Amelia when they could no longer hide behind the mask of silent servants. This moment was inevitable, and so, in this house full of secrets and unspeakable desires, Jane began to change her perception of the world. But she did not know that her path was only at the beginning, and soon her life would be filled with unexpected turns that would change not only her fate, but also the fates of other servants in this house. Jane, like many other servants, was already awake. For her, the morning began not with coffee and a soft pillow, but with a harsh alarm signal that reminded her that a new day left no time for rest. She quickly got up from the rough bed in the attic, closed the door behind her, and hurried into the hallway, where the cold air was saturated with the smell of old wood and the coziness of home. But coziness is a word that she could apply only to the furnishings of the master's house. Despite this, Jane feels no peace. Her hands glide over pots and pans, skillfully preparing breakfast, but she cannot shake off the feeling of pressure. The masters do not complain, but every wrong step, every mistake can be a disaster for her. The whole life of a servant is a continuous game on the edge, where the stakes for error are too high. There are several other servants working nearby, young Mary, an old cook, and several helpers preparing the breakfast dishes. Each of them knows his role, but still there is a sense of silence, as if each one is in his own isolation, despite the common work. Mary, standing at the stove, quickly stirs a pot of porridge, her gaze sliding restlessly to the window where the first rays of light are beginning to gather. She knows that the day will be long, but she cannot calm down. She can't even look up until she reaches the end of the hallway. In her hands is not just a tray of food, it is a symbol of her invisible role in the house. She must be invisible, silent, not invading personal space. The owners, drinking their morning tea, have already forgotten that people like her provide their comfort. For them, she is just a shadow that has no right to make a mistake. She can't get too close, can't allow herself to be part of this morning scene. She is always at a distance, always an observer. While the hosts enjoy their time discussing the latest news and making plans for the day, she must be ready for the next assignment. Her life is an endless chain of actions, where every detail matters and her personal desires and experiences remain invisible to everyone. This is her moment. She must appear quickly and unnoticed to service his request. Before she can take a step, she is already running to the door and carefully opening it. All her movements are measured to perfection. Jane understands that there is a responsibility hidden behind every gesture. If she hesitates, if she is not quick or attentive enough, the consequences could be most unexpected. Every little detail must be taken into account, every object in its place. Jane heads to the library, where she must prepare everything for the master's morning reading. There are already books in his chair, neatly stacked on the table, and she must arrange them so that everything looks perfect. Working here, she feels that her life is passing her by. She serves this world, but is not a part of it. Every day, every morning, she finds her place in this mechanism, unable to step outside her role. He doesn't seem to notice her. His life is one continuous cycle of chopping, frying, cooking. He works from morning until night, but his labor is never rewarded to the extent that it should be. And yet, he doesn't seek attention or recognition. He just does his job. Jane often wonders why she is so desperate to be part of something bigger, something she will never have, unlike the cook, who seems content with his situation. This is the moment when the building wakes up, but for her the morning never ends. She remains in her position, continuing to work without breaks. She feels her body tired, but she cannot afford to relax. She knows that her day will be long and that she will have to face even more tasks before she can exhale. But to do this, she must survive among all these invisible but relentless expectations. It is an endless service that has no end. And in this endless routine, she finds her place, not always realizing that her work is not appreciated. She will always be part of this house, but she will never be a real part of it. She remains a shadow that appears only for a moment in the light, and this light is her only reward. The day goes on, and Jane, as always, keeps herself in check. But today something is different. Her gaze, accidentally meeting the gaze of one of the hosts, remains in her memory. The moment when she felt that her presence was finally noticed, but it happened so quickly that she barely had time to realize that everything could change. These were not just glances. This was the moment when she realized that her life could perhaps be something more than just a duty. As soon as the morning turns to afternoon, Jane feels tired, but she knows that now is not the time to rest. There is still much work to do. She will continue her day, forgetting about her tiredness, watching every movement and every word that can affect her future fate. She is an invisible part of the mechanism that must remain silent and continue to work, because this is her only role in this house. When the alarm sounded, it was not just the beginning of a new day, but a signal for a continuous struggle for survival in this strict society. Jane had long been accustomed to a strict regime. She knew that her day would be full of endless work, where every hour, every minute was important. Working tirelessly, like a robot, was her daily norm. The same question constantly sounded in her head. What will happen if I make a mistake? But such questions did not matter. A mistake is not only a reason for punishment, but also for losing the respect of the owners. Every corner of the house must be checked. Every little thing must be in its place. Jane hurries to the master bedrooms to remove all traces of their night's rest. Her hands work automatically, not thinking about the fact that she is actually tired. Every movement is measured. Every touch must be careful. Her face expresses concentration, but inside her body, tension begins to accumulate, which she cannot help but notice. She knew that if something was wrong, it would be said, but no one would care that she was tired. Every day they became part of a machine that worked not for their own convenience, but for the convenience of its owners. In a house filled with luxury, no one thought about the fact that perhaps it was the work of these invisible people that made everything so perfect. Jane had become accustomed to working in conditions of non-stop activity, but every time she looked at her colleagues, she felt that they were also oppressed by this cycle. Unnoticed, but necessary. His face was hard, almost emotionless, but there was a deep weariness in his eyes. He lived in this house, but he was so absorbed in his duty that he had lost his own identity. Jane wondered how many servants became like Goodwin, so subservient to their work that they forgot they had once been people with dreams and hopes and desires. They were too busy discussing breakfast business, enjoying the sumptuous food and drink, but Jane knew that if they noticed her, it would only be for a mistake. The masters never looked at the servants with gratitude. They were arrogant and demanding. Every glance was cold and distant, not paying attention to those who provided their comfort. A servant was not supposed to exist as an individual. His task was to be an invisible part of the background. Every corner of the house, every plate, every glass had to be perfect. She began to wonder, if all this is for the owners, then who is she? After all, she was not allowed to be like that. She could only make sure that everything was in order and did not make mistakes. It was a constant fear. What will happen if she does not complete the task 100%? Мэри, ее коллега, пыталась успеть убрать столы и комнаты, но ее лицо уже было изможденным. Джейн заметила, как она слегка дрожала, когда поднимала тяжелые вещи. Каждая слуга в доме, включая Джейн, была своего рода машиной, работающей на износ. Это не было жизнью, а существованием, где труд был неотделим от человеческой сущности, но, как и у других, у нее не было права на слабость. Двери с огромными бронзовыми ручками, витражи, позолоченные рамки — все эти роскошные элементы мебели казались такими недоступными для нее. Она была как маленькая тень, которая мелькала в этих великолепных интерьерах, но никогда не становилась частью этого мира. Она устала от этой тени, от роли невидимого труженика, который остается вне поля зрения. Она задумалась, что могло бы случиться, если бы она просто остановилась и сказала, что устала. Были моменты, когда она пыталась найти немного времени, чтобы просто взглянуть на мир за окнами дома, где был такой же яркий свет и люди, идущие по улице. Но этого времени было так мало, и она всегда чувствовала, как ее увлекает этот круговорот работы. Ее лицо не выражало эмоций, ее движения были почти автоматическими, у Джейн не было места для мечтаний, ее жизнь была ограничена задачами, которые она должна была выполнить. Каждый слуга был на своем месте, выполняя задачи, но все чувствовали одну и ту же усталость. Джейн начала задаваться вопросом, когда все это закончится, когда она будет иметь право на отдых. Но ответы не приходили. На протяжении дня все работы переходили от одного к другому, и все снова повторялось. Это было как дежавю. Все повторялось с точностью до мелочей, без конца и без надежды на перемены. На ужин хозяева снова устраивали праздник. Столы ломились от еды, но слуги снова были на заднем плане. Мэри, которая работала в кухне, шептала Джейн: «Посмотри на них, они никогда не осознают, как трудно нам». Джейн не ответила, но в ее душе что-то шевельнулось. Она часто слышала такие слова, но никогда не могла позволить себе размышлять о них. Все думали, что их задача просто работать и молчать. Но даже молчание имело свои пределы. Прошли часы, и, наконец, наступил момент, когда все слуги могли ненадолго расслабиться. Но для Джейн отдых был лишь временным. Каждое ее движение было связано с тем, что она была частью этого вечного цикла. И хотя она пыталась найти хотя бы небольшие моменты радости, каждый раз ее мысли возвращались к работе. Труд и дисциплина в этом доме были ее сущностью, ее жизнью, но никогда не ее мечтой. Unlike her hosts, who enjoyed soft feather beds and soft light from the windows, her place was in a small attic room where the floor was cold and the roof leaked every time it rained. The cramped walls seemed to close in on her, and the only light was a tiny candle that barely illuminated the entire corner. Her bed was hard and uncomfortable, but she couldn't afford to complain. It was common for those of her status. Jane was used to it. But sometimes, when the night air was especially cold, she couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to live in warmth and peace like her hosts. Her work began there. Every morning she began with cleaning, and it was a routine for her to begin the day by scrubbing the floors or cleaning the silver. It took time and patience, but most importantly, speed. The owners could not wait. The kitchen was her next stop. There was so much work there that sometimes her hands began to ache from the constant movement. She chopped vegetables, cooked soups, scrubbed pots, but even in the midst of all this work, her eyes constantly turned to the bright rooms of the owners, where there was a coziness and the furniture was so luxuriously decorated that Jane could not help but think what it would be like to be a part of that world, even for a moment. She held plates of the finest food in her hands, but her place was always in the shadows. She could see her masters discussing their affairs, smiling, laughing, but she knew that she was just a servant to them, whose only role was to serve. Sometimes she caught the eye of one of them, but she did not dare look them in the eye longer than her duties required. A servant should not take up a place in this world. She should be no more than an invisible part of it. And although Jane felt that her life was part of this mechanism, she still could not rid herself of a feeling of emptiness. During this time, she often tried to think of something other than just how she had to get through her next errand. But her room was so small and the air so cold that she couldn't forget about her life as a servant. She tried not to think about how she would like to really rest, or at least sit with a book, which would be a real rest for her. But she wasn't allowed to. There was no time for rest for those in her position. Her rest was a silent wait for the next day, and there was no talk of anything else. Work was her life. There was no other way for her than to continue each day, one task after another. And although her body and soul demanded rest, she knew that here, in this house, no one would give her time to rest. Everything was busy with the tasks on which the work of the entire house depended. She had no right to weakness, no right to rest, and her own desires always remained in the background. To work was her only right. Mary looked tired, her eyes were dull, and her movements were slow. Jane saw her sigh, looking out the window at the green garden that was never accessible to her. Although Mary said nothing, her eyes clearly showed that her soul was also searching for answers. Jane could not help but feel the same in herself. It was a silent brotherhood, a brotherhood of all the servants who could not afford to relax, but who, deep down, dreamed of something more. Every day she got up and did the same thing as the day before. Every day it was the same work, the same tedious routine, and although she never complained, her soul was looking for some change. Every evening, when she lay down in her small room, she tried to think of something good, but her thoughts inevitably returned to the fact that she had lost this day again, that again she was nothing but a servant. And although she had a hard time finding any meaning in it, she knew that just being here was something. But what if she could be someone more? She noticed that they could not afford to think, but only did their work as if there was no other life than the one they led. In the evenings, they sat together in their room, silent, tired of everything. It was a strange silence, in which there was neither joy nor pain. It was the silence of people who, despite their importance, could not become part of the world they served. For them, this was not just work, it was their life. She had always tried to be perfect, but now her actions had become automatic, meaningless. That was the day she realized that her life was not just a job. She had become part of this huge mechanism in which neither she nor her feelings mattered. All that mattered was not to make a mistake, not to displease the owners. Everything else was secondary. Every day in this life was a test, and every morning was a new challenge. But although she knew that her life was unlikely to change, There was still something inside her that continued to fight for change. She did not know when it would happen, but in her heart there was confidence that one day she would find a way out, and at that moment she felt that her existence was not as empty as it had seemed before. It was her first duty, even before she took part in the preparation of meals for her masters. In the kitchen, where the smells of fresh bread and roasting vegetables mingled with the musty air, stood a humble bowl of porridge. To her it was everything, the basic morning meal that she and the other servants received each day. Although she was grateful for it, her thoughts often wandered to the question of why the food for the maids had to be so meager, while the masters enjoyed the delicacies that she lovingly prepared. Eating for her was not just a routine, but also a reminder of her situation. Every time she took a spoonful of a simple but filling breakfast, she felt that her life was the same as the food, simple, without frills. For her, it was not a choice, but a necessity. She had no right to complain. The servants, like her, were always content with little, always forced to be satisfied with what they were given. The variety of tastes, the festive dishes, the multi-layered cakes that the masters enjoyed remained something unattainable for her. Many of them had grown accustomed to this diet and did not complain, but Jane noticed that their eyes were growing dull, like her own. The servants knew that no more could be asked, that their role was to do their work without complaint. Food was part of their service, part of their lives, overshadowed by what was on their masters' tables. And although they were given food to get them through the day, none of them could afford to expect anything better. The conversations between the servants, filled with laughter, often hid their true feelings. No one spoke of how hungry they were or how long it had been since they had truly enjoyed a good meal. Jane could not remember the last time she had eaten something good. Sometimes, when she washed the dishes or prepared the tables for her masters, she seemed to smell of food that she had never received. And yet, despite this, she continued to work because she knew that there was no other life for her. Far from her understanding was the world of exquisite food and drink. Golden dishes, rich treats, these were not for her. She saw how everyone was gorging themselves on delicacies, and inside she felt a sense of injustice. Why was she not allowed to eat the same? Why should she be content with simple porridge or stale bread, while her masters enjoyed what she could only dream of? These thoughts, although disturbing, remained inside, because she knew that she could not even hint at such a thing. She was a servant, and her whole place in this house was to remain invisible, not demand anything, and simply serve. She watched as the master's servants finished their evening meals, as they sat at the tables, enjoying something far more delicious than she could have ever imagined. These were the evenings when she could not take her eyes off these treats, although she could not afford even a full portion. She knew that her place was in the servants' kitchen, not in this luxurious hall filled with treats that were not intended for her. Although the food given to the servants was filling and enough to survive, she couldn't help but notice how her strength was waning. She could no longer calmly watch her masters enjoy the delicious dishes. She noticed her face becoming dull and her body beginning to lose energy. For her, food was no longer just a source of life, but also a reminder that her place was limited. With each meal, she became more and more aware of how much her situation was affecting her health and well-being. Even when she felt her body couldn't stand the constant toil, she kept working. Servants couldn't afford to complain. It was part of their existence. Every day, as Jane took her modest portion of food, she reminded herself over and over again that it was her choice. But what kind of choice was it if it was the only one possible? Perhaps if she were allowed to taste just one of the dishes she saw on the tables of her masters, she might feel like a full part of this world. But that was where her dreams ended. She knew that her place was with the other servants, and food was still part of her role, part of what she had to endure. Despite these thoughts, Jane continued her work, trying not to notice that the other servants might be thinking the same thing. The simple food that was provided was her main source of sustenance. Everything else was out of her reach. But her inner restlessness, her discontent at not being allowed to be part of something greater, remained with her when she took another spoonful of simple porridge. The inner sense of injustice did not disappear, but it became part of her, as did her daily life. Each day was filled not only with endless tasks, but also with hidden intrigues that remained out of her sight, but were always on her shoulders. There was something more than just work within these walls, something dark and hidden that no servant could afford to completely ignore. She could feel it in the cold stares of the other servants, in the way they quickly looked away when she tried to talk about something that was outside her duties. It was a world where everyone knew that silence was not just an art, but a necessity. Everything in the house was subordinated to their desire to control. They could choose everything: what to wear, what food to serve, who would be in their circle. But if she made the slightest mistake, she immediately became part of this hidden mechanism, a person who became part of a game where the stakes were too high. Many maids and servants became pawns in these unspeakable games, and Jane began to realize that her calm was only an illusion. Her role was much more complex than it seemed at first glance. It was a conversation between two old servants, leaning towards each other, talking about things Jane was not supposed to hear. Despite her efforts to be invisible, the words penetrated her consciousness. They discussed the master's secrets, hidden debts, intrigues that concerned wealth, even rumors of how one of the masters was running a business illegally, hiding everything from the general public. It was like a web into which she had been unwittingly drawn, and it began to make her uneasy. What would be the consequences if someone found out that she had witnessed these conversations? Mr. Goodwin, the old butler, was as reserved as ever, but there was something else in his eyes, something that made Jane feel he knew more than he was saying. His silence was not just silent, it was laden with a weight that was difficult to ignore. Every move he made was calculated, every word carefully chosen. Jane felt that his silence was not just a way of being discreet, it was a way of surviving in a house where trust had no place. Jane was shocked by this answer. Mary seemed to know much more than she was letting on. It was like a silent warning. Jane tried to coax her to reveal what was going on, but Mary only remarked that maids should be everywhere, but never too visible. This statement seemed to reveal the essence of servants' lives, to be a part of everything, but at the same time to remain out of it. At this reception, important matters were discussed that concerned not only the family's wealth, but also their reputation. The people who came seemed arrogant and confident, and the conversations were full of hidden hints and ambiguous phrases. Jane could not help but notice how her presence slipped away during these moments. She had to be a shadow so that no one's eyes fell on her, but it was almost impossible. The air was filled with tension, and no matter how hard she tried, Jane felt like she was part of something much more complex and dangerous than just her duties. She was beginning to realize that her life wasn't just dull and monotonous. There was a hidden meaning to it, not just serving her masters, but participating in a more complex, more dangerous game. All these conversations she overheard, even if only by accident, made her feel like her role in the house was more than just work. It was as if she were part of a larger, hidden system that she couldn't control. And when she tried to imagine what was going on behind closed doors, she realized that her fate in this house was more intriguing than she might have thought. Mr. Hartford was irritated, and his voice was loud and threatening. She couldn't help but notice that the conversation was unusual, especially since no servant was supposed to hear what they were discussing. She felt the pressure on her chest increase. She was part of a system where knowledge was dangerous and silence was salvation. But what if she did know more than she needed to? How would that change her life? Every day her inner world became more crowded. She realized that her place in this house was more important than she liked to think. Sometimes, as she passed by, she noticed how the hosts exchanged nervous glances, and although their conversations did not concern her, her presence did not go unnoticed. It was not only tension, it was the understanding that Jane was part of this world, a little world that was full of secrets and hidden threats. Silence was the most important weapon for a servant, but she could not simply remain silent forever. If she wanted, she could intervene in these intrigues, start asking questions and looking for answers. But she knew that it would be a dangerous game, and yet no matter how hard she tried, one thought remained with her. Perhaps it was in these hidden games that her role lay, and this role was not as simple as it seemed. Every step, every gesture, every word mattered. In a Victorian household where everything was strictly regulated, her place was determined not only by her status, but also by how she carried out her duties. She could not afford to make mistakes. If she was late in serving food or forgot to wipe the silver spoons, no one would take her seriously. Servants had no room for weakness, and although Jane tried her best to maintain her reputation, she knew that it was too vulnerable. One mistake could be disastrous, and there was almost no way to correct it. She knew that her every move would be closely watched. The masters did not watch her directly, but each servant was an invisible part of their world, only noticed when something went wrong. Jane often noticed how her colleagues watched her work, and this feeling of being watched made her work even harder. She knew that her reputation in this house depended on how well she performed each task. It was a game in which there was no room for error. He was the one who, to some extent, ran the household, and his opinion of how the servants did their work was decisive. His silent observation, his rare comments that remained discreet and unnoticed by others, mattered. Jane always felt his stern gaze on her. He knew everything. He knew which servants deserved praise and which deserved punishment. Every glance he gave her was a hidden assessment of her work, and she could not afford to disappoint him. Mr. Goodwin was not only a symbol of power, but also a reflection of her very reputation in the household. It wasn't obvious, but she felt like everything she did was being judged. Even when she tried to ignore it, something inside her told her that her reputation depended on how others perceived her work. It was a test of sorts. On one hand, the desire to do everything perfectly, on the other, the fear of losing respect. Jane couldn't afford to relax because she knew that one wrong move could cost her her place in this house. There were those who looked for minor mistakes on someone, and those who tried to maintain the reputation of others. But for Jane, it was important not only to maintain the reputation of a servant who always does everything right, but also not to be the center of discussions. Sometimes she heard how other servants whispered about her, evaluating her work. These were not always pleasant conversations, but Jane could not afford to lose her composure. After all, it is important for a servant not only to do his job, but also to remain in the shadows, not attracting unnecessary attention. The less attention she attracted from her masters, the more chances she had to maintain her position. But if she made a mistake, if something did not suit her masters, her reputation would instantly collapse. It was hard to comprehend, because every day she tried to be invisible and impeccable. But the hidden need to be perfect was a heavy burden. Reputation was like fragile porcelain. It was worth damaging it just a little, and it was impossible to restore. She knew that no one would give her a chance to rest. No one would say, "Well done." All she got in return was silence and the absence of comments. But even silence was not a sign of approval. but rather an understatement. And when the room grew dark and all the servants went to bed, Jane often sat, thinking how she wished her efforts were noticed, that someone would see her work and not just her invisibility. She felt that her reputation lay not in her qualities as a person, but in how invisible she was to this world. But for Jane, this was something alien. She had to be like a shadow, not attract attention, be a faceless part of this world. This was her way of survival, to remain in the shadows, not to stand out, not to say too much. But with each passing day, this mask became harder and harder to wear. Jane felt like she was losing her inner world, when every step she took was measured, every glance was verified, so as not to create a reason for conversations behind her back. She was not as reserved as the others, and expressed her opinions openly. Jane watched her, trying to understand how this new girl could allow herself to be so uninhibited. But when she learned that the maid was known among the servants for her activity and liveliness, as well as for her mistakes, Jane realized one thing: reputation was not always associated with impeccable work. Sometimes it was possible to remain the center of attention, but not to lose your position if you behaved correctly. She was a servant, unobtrusive, but also untalked about, unnoticed. That was her role, and she couldn't change it. She had to be what she was perceived to be: quiet, unnoticeable, perfect at her job. And though she knew she could be more, her place had already been decided. And in that silence, in that endless effort to hide, she was slowly losing the part of herself that had once believed she could be someone important. Every day, in a house full of strict moral rules, she was faced with questions that she could not simply ignore. There were many unspoken moral standards in this house, unspoken but obvious. For example, servants had no right to their own opinions, no right to make mistakes. The moral code that everyone obeyed here was unambiguous: be inconspicuous, do your job without unnecessary words, and do not express dissatisfaction. But what if this system at some point contradicted Jane's inner convictions? She began to notice that her own moral guidelines were gradually distorted. She couldn't help but wonder, why did masters enjoy everything that their status entitled them to, while servants had to be content with modest rations and live by strict rules? It seemed wrong, but on the other hand, she had been brought up in such a way that every protest against this injustice was perceived as a violation. The moral dilemma she faced daily was not about what was right, but how to avoid punishment for any deviation from these invisible but strict norms. There was another side: the morality of the masters. Their code was unwritten, but everyone knew that it was important. Masters, like all other high ranks in society, had their own principles, which often contradicted the moral rules that servants were obliged to obey. Jane understood that these moral standards were not equal. They were aimed at maintaining the status and well-being of the masters, and there was no place for servants in these rules. They had their own laws, their own principles. They all knew that they had to be quiet, not to express their opinions or discuss moral issues that affected their masters. Even when obvious things went against their own understanding of justice, they kept silent. Silence was part of the moral rules, and this silence was safe for them. But Jane could not help feeling that this silence, this following someone else's morality, was a deception. Why should she be silent if she saw injustice? Why did silence become her moral duty? Every day she faced situations where she wanted to say something, where she wanted to express her dissatisfaction with cruelty or injustice, but she held herself back. She knew that her role was to be an invisible, silent part of this world. But the internal resistance grew, and she could no longer hold back her emotions. The moral standards to which she was accustomed began to seem too restrictive, too unfair. We all play a role in this system, Jane, she said. Our role is to be invisible. That is our morality. It was almost like an admission that her life was not a life, but simply fulfilling obligations. At that moment, Jane felt how this morality game was limiting her personal freedom. She began to understand that the morality she had been living by was not her morality. It was an alien principle imposed by the system. Why did she have to follow rules that did not reflect her own beliefs? Why did she have to be part of a system that was not allowed to change anything? The morality by which she lived seemed strange, incomplete, unattractive. Why did she have to follow these moral rules when she saw them violated at every turn? Why did she have to remain silent when justice was on her side? These questions gave rise to a protest that she suppressed, knowing that any expression of discontent could lead to punishment. She followed the moral rules that were imposed by her position, but her soul was beginning to rebel. There was no space in her head for these alien moral standards, and she could no longer ignore this internal tension. She understood that her actions, although they met external requirements, were not honest with herself. It was like a lie that she continued to tell, trying to please the owners and keep her place in this house. But the truth was inside her, and she could not ignore it. She understood that if she continued to follow these rules, she would lose herself completely. She decided to look for a way out of this situation, although she did not know how. She felt that if she did not fight for her beliefs, her soul would be completely swallowed up by the system. And although she did not know how to win, she decided not to let this system completely suppress her inner world. She began to look for opportunities, for protests, even small ones, that would allow her to be true to her conscience. She knew that the rules that were dictated to her were alien to her, and her moral struggle was just beginning. Internal protest became her guiding star, and although she could not immediately change her life, she felt that this path, the path of fighting her own morality, was her only chance to gain personal freedom. Her life was part of this machine, part of a mechanism that never stopped. The morning began with obligations, the day was filled with tasks, and the evening was left only to have time to rest, without thinking about the fact that she had to be ready for the next day. The only moment when she could be herself was when she was alone with herself in her tiny room. But even in these moments of peace, she could not escape the thought that her life was completely consumed by obligations that left no room for personal experiences or dreams. But it was different. The house had many rules, and each day was subject to strict discipline. There were moments when she saw the other servants passing the time by talking, laughing, and discussing their lives. She envied their opportunity to relax, but she could not afford such luxury. Sometimes her thoughts wandered to what she could do if she had even one free day. Could she allow herself to simply be herself? In this question lay her inner rebellion, a rebellion against a life that did not give her the chance to be an individual. Despite the many people around her, she felt lonely. It wasn't a physical isolation, but an emotional emptiness that stayed with her when she came home after a hard day. In the evenings, sitting in her small room, Jane increasingly wondered how she could feel like a person, and not just a mechanism fulfilling other people's desires. She couldn't remember the last time she allowed herself to feel the joy of communication or closeness with other people. She couldn't even remember when her life had been filled with anything other than work and responsibilities. His name was Thomas. He was young, energetic, and genuinely interested in a life that seemed to have nothing in common with what Jane was used to seeing in her daily routine. Thomas was a fine man. He was not absorbed in his service like everyone else, and his jokes, his bright outlook on the world, attracted her attention. Sometimes they exchanged glances, sometimes he smiled at her, and although she could not allow herself to think about it seriously, She liked his presence. It would be wrong. She was a servant, and he was just another servant. Yet every word he said, every look he gave her was something new, like a flash of light in the endless darkness of her life. He was kind to her, genuinely interested in her life, and she felt her heart begin to respond to his kind words and actions. She knew that such a relationship could not be possible for them. They were servants, and they had no right to privacy, no room for feelings like love. But despite her awareness, she could not ignore how her heart began to beat faster when he approached. This feeling was so forbidden that it became even more attractive to her. Thoughts swirled in her head about how nice it would be if she had the opportunity to just communicate with him, to be near him and not just follow her role. It was like a small spark that began to flare up, despite all her efforts to extinguish it. She began to notice how her inner world was changing. Every day she woke up with a new feeling that life shouldn't be just about work, that she deserved to be more than just a part of this machine. But there was a second voice in her head, a voice that said she had no right to feel. She was a servant. Her job was to do her job without any personal ambitions. Their eyes met, and in that moment there was a silence between them, full of unspoken words. Thomas looked at her in a way no one else had ever looked at her, with warmth, with genuine interest. Jane felt her heart clench, but in that moment she realized that this simple meeting of eyes was much more significant to her than she could allow herself to understand. She tried to hide her emotions, turned away, but her soul screamed at this instant, almost forbidden recognition. She couldn't understand why this small moment had shaken her so much. It was just a meeting of eyes, but for her it was something much more. She felt her inner world beginning to change. She suddenly realized that she wanted something more. She couldn't allow herself to dream about love or romance, but this feeling she was experiencing was real. It was a bright and beautiful feeling that had been foreign to her for so long, and although she tried to suppress it, she knew that she could no longer do so. She fulfilled her duties again, worked as usual. But there was something different in her soul. Every step she took was now full of internal struggle. On the one hand, she knew that she had to be the perfect servant, and on the other, her thoughts kept returning to Thomas, to that brief moment that had become a turning point in her life. She knew that she had to ignore her feelings, but still, somewhere inside, she could no longer hide the fact that these feelings would not go away. Jane began to realize that her personal life was not something impossible. She must not forget that she was a person, and that her desires mattered too. She saw something in his eyes that she couldn't ignore. She couldn't say if it was love or simple admiration, but she felt that it changed her. It was a moment of understanding that she was not just a servant who served in silence. She could be someone more. But would she be able to change her life, her destiny, or would she remain forever in this house, in this world that did not give her the right to be herself? These questions haunted her, but inside her, a hope began to emerge that she could find a way to a real life. Her relationship with her masters had always been built on clear boundaries, and she, like the other servants, knew her place. However, over time, as she worked in the house, the relationship began to become more complicated. Sometimes the looks that her masters exchanged with her seemed different. They were not simple, invisible looks, as always. They were looks filled with something inexpressible, but clearly different from the usual disdain with which they viewed the other servants. These moments alarmed her, and she could not help but think that something was beginning to arise between her and her masters that should not have been there. She felt a growing tension between them, and it both attracted and frightened her. Jane began to notice how every step she took in the house was under close scrutiny. It was not simply attention to her work, it was something more personal, something that could not be explained in simple words. The host did not ask her directly about her personal life, but there were moments when their conversations concerned her. Mr. Hartford, the owner of the house, sometimes asked her questions about her family, about her past, about what brought her to this house. She answered briefly and neutrally, trying to avoid excessive frankness, but she felt how this interest was beginning to cross the line of what was permissible. At such moments her face became a little red, and internal doubts increasingly took over her thoughts. Mr. Hartford, sitting at the table, was discussing some important matters with his wife, and it seemed that his gaze accidentally met hers. It was a moment when time seemed to slow down. There was something in his eyes that Jane could not immediately understand, something more than just interest in the servant. She quickly looked away, but the internal tension did not disappear. What had previously been just ignoring her presence was now more complex. A question began to arise in her mind. Was it possible that her masters were beginning to perceive her differently from other servants? Mrs. Hartford, for example, became more attentive to her work, paying attention to details she had not paid attention to before. There were moments when she would accidentally touch her hand while passing something, and although it was only for a moment, Jane felt her heart begin to beat faster. Mr. Hartford, for his part, sometimes came into the kitchen to talk to her about insignificant things, but these conversations became more and more personal. She felt her role in the house gradually changing, as if by fate, but this change was too dangerous. She could not allow herself to think about it seriously, but there was something in their looks and their actions that continued to haunt her. She felt that there was more to Mr. Hartford's eyes than just recognition of her work. Sometimes his questions about her life seemed deeper than he really meant to admit. It was as if he were trying to understand her personality, her inner world, and this frightened her, because she knew that her place in this house was simply not to be noticed. She could not allow herself to think that her work could become anything more than a service. It was inadmissible. It violated all moral and social boundaries. Mr. Hartford offered her tea, and their conversation began to move away from the usual formalities and toward a more personal level. She tried to keep her distance, answering neutrally, but his questions became more and more revealing. He asked how she felt in the house, what she thought of her life. These questions seemed to come from an interest in her as a person, and not just as a good servant. It was a moment when she felt the air in the room thicken. Her heart began to beat faster, and her mind began to unravel complex thoughts. Were his intentions sincere, or was this just another gesture by which he was trying to show her her place in the house? She couldn't ignore the feelings she was starting to experience any longer. Despite her attempts to distance herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that her hosts were starting to look at her differently. It wasn't just professional respect, it was something more. Every day, every encounter with them was now a psychological game where she couldn't figure out exactly where she stood. She couldn't stop thinking about how things could change if she decided to trust these feelings. But she knew that was impossible. She couldn't risk everything she had. She could no longer work as before without noticing the changes in her master's attitude. She began to notice how she herself had begun to change. Her answers became shorter, her movements more careful. She began to avoid Mr. Hartford's gaze, afraid that he would notice her emotions again. But every time their eyes met, she felt something inside her more than just respect for her status. It was something complicated, something forbidden that she could not allow herself to acknowledge. The emotions she felt could not be ignored. They had become part of her inner struggle, part of what she could not erase from her life. She understood that these feelings could not be accepted in this house, but how could she continue to serve if her soul was torn by this conflict? She could not find an answer, could not find a way to get rid of this feeling. But despite all this, she knew that she would have to hide her feelings and continue her service, because the choice was clear. Her role in the house remained unchanged. It was not so much the attitude of her employers towards her as her attitude towards herself. She could no longer simply go about her duties without being aware of the conflict within her. This inner rebellion, this forbidden interest she felt in Mr. Hartford, was becoming her shadow, and she knew she could never completely rid herself of it. She knew that her place in this house remained unchanged, but in her heart a process of change had begun that could not be stopped. It had all started with simple glances, small, almost imperceptible gestures, but now that she looked back, she realized that it had been much more. The strange tension in the air had become more pronounced. The host had begun to behave differently towards her, and Jane felt that her place in the house was no longer what it had been before. She could not shake the feeling that something had broken in their relationship. Those glances, those casual touches that had once seemed insignificant, were now becoming an integral part of her daily life. She felt how her world was gradually narrowing, and all her actions were now becoming part of something more dangerous. Her meeting with Mr. Hartford, his tender words and glances that could not have been simply accidental, began to seem to her not so insignificant. He began to ask her questions more and more often, to be interested in her opinion. He talked to her not only about work, but also about how she felt in this house. These conversations became not just ordinary, they began to touch on the personal, invisible to others. Jane increasingly felt that her life, once clearly defined by her role, was now under threat. She did not know how to respond to these changes. She had the feeling that she was becoming part of something more complex and dangerous than just her role in the house. The actions of the masters became more and more personal, and she could no longer remain the same as before. Every look from Mr. Hartford became more and more significant. Every word he said contained something more than a simple, polite address to a servant. He even began to joke with her, which was rare for the masters, and her reaction to these jokes was not the same as to ordinary words. She began to feel how her heart began to beat faster when he was near, and it was both pleasant and scary. She tried to hide her emotions, but they became more and more obvious. Jane began to realize that the consequences of this were already inevitable. Jane thought it was just another normal conversation, but when she walked into the office, she felt the atmosphere in the room change. He was there alone, sitting at his desk, and he seemed a little awkward himself. He motioned for her to sit across from him, but Jane couldn't help but notice how he looked. His eyes were fixed on hers, and there was something new in that look, something that hadn't been there before. Jane felt her heart beat faster, and despite her inner protest, she sat down. This moment had become a turning point in their relationship, and she already knew that everything would change after this. He asked how she felt, how her work in the house was, how she felt about the conditions in which she had to live. Jane answered honestly, trying not to reveal her feelings, but his questions became more and more personal. He asked about her children, about how she experienced loneliness, how she felt in this house. There was more than just concern in his voice, but something much more intimate. Jane tried to control herself, but at that moment she realized that her feelings were no longer under control. She felt her heart begin to beat faster, as if he penetrated the very depths of her soul. Jane knew it the moment he finished asking her about her life. Mr. Hartford began talking about her role in the house, how much he valued her work, but his words sounded different than usual. He began talking about how she deserved more, how she shouldn't be limited to this role. He spoke as if her life could be different, as if she could be someone important, someone more than just a servant. The words began to sound like a promise, but also like a dangerous and deceptive invitation. Jane couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge, and that every step she took could change everything. Her life, which had seemed so clear and understandable before, was now becoming foggy and uncertain. Mr. Hartford kept appearing in her thoughts. Her work, which had once been the main focus of her life, was now just a background. She could think of nothing else but what had happened in the office. How could she continue to serve in this house if every day, every glance from the owner now filled her soul with anxiety and worry? She tried to hide her feelings, but they did not go away. Everything she had experienced that day had become part of her inner world, and she could no longer take it all back. She knew that all this was dangerous, that her feelings could not continue, but she couldn't just ignore what was happening. Mr. Hartford had become an important figure in her life, and she couldn't just give up on him. The internal protest grew stronger, and Jane could no longer remain unperturbed. She was a person, she had the right to feelings, but at the same time she understood that her role was clearly limited. All this was too complicated, and she could not find an answer to how it would all end. The looks of her masters, their words, even the very atmosphere of the house began to seem alien to her. She felt that her inner world and the outer world were no longer coinciding. Her feelings for Mr. Hartford grew stronger, but at the same time she realized that it was impossible. There was no room for a servant and a master to be anything more than just servant and master. And yet, despite this, her heart could not stop, and the thought that her life could change became part of her inner struggle. She began to realize that her role in this house was no longer so simple. Mr. Hartford and his attention to her had changed everything. She couldn't continue to live as she had before, ignoring what was happening between them. But despite all these feelings, she still couldn't allow herself to change her life. She was the servant, and he was the master. These boundaries were too strong to be broken, and although her heart knew that things were not as they should be, she knew that this was the beginning of something she couldn't control. Every day she wore this symbol of her submission, but today there was something different. A glance in the mirror showed not just a servant, but a woman who felt her inner world becoming increasingly conflicted. These feelings, which she could not ignore, tormented her. On the one hand, she knew that her duty was service, complete submission, and nothing more. But on the other, she felt her heart begin to beat faster, with every look, with every word of her master's. This internal gap became unbearable for her. She felt how hard it was to be between what was expected of her and what she really felt. His cold but considerate kindness exerted a magical influence on her. She could not deny that his glances, his words, even his small gestures seemed to be directed at her not only as a servant, but as a person. And although she knew that her place was to be invisible, her heart could not refuse the spark that was beginning to flare up in her soul. It was something dangerous, but she could not contain these feelings. The more she tried to suppress them, the stronger they became. And every day she felt more and more that these feelings led her to dereliction of her duties. She could no longer simply be a servant. Mr. Hartford had invited her to discuss the details of the job, and their conversation was filled not just with duties, but with what was between them. His voice was soft but confident, and despite all her inner resistance, Jane noticed how her body responded to his presence. Every word, every movement of his seemed filled with some special meaning. She realized that at that moment she was not just a servant, but a woman he was talking to. But at the same time, she knew that she had no right to feel this way, that her feelings were inappropriate and dangerous. Jane tried to maintain her impartiality, but her thoughts were torn apart by this internal conflict. She tried to justify herself, thought that she was just doing her job, but her heart told her otherwise. Memories of the look they had exchanged flashed through her mind. of how he seemed to see her not only as a servant, but also as a woman, and that was her weakness. She tried to hold back, but her inner conflict became more and more painful. The fear that she would not be able to contain her feelings, and the desire to be honest with herself mixed in her soul. With each passing minute, with each glance, it became more and more difficult for her to keep her distance. She became more attentive to Mr. Hartford's every word, every look. She began to notice how his attitude toward her began to change, as if he too sensed this strange balance between them. But despite this, she knew that her place was here, in this role, in this house. This was her duty, and she had no right to give in to feelings she could not explain. Her work, her life were predetermined, and if she gave in to her emotions, her life would be ruined. She tried to ignore these thoughts, but the more she tried to suppress them, the stronger they became. Even short phrases that had been neutral before now seemed filled with some hidden meaning. Mr. Hartford continued to talk to her, but each time their conversations became more and more personal. He began to be interested in her opinion, to ask about her life outside the house, and it was like a silent admission that she was not just a servant to him, but a person with whom he was ready to maintain a dialogue. Jane could not understand what was happening, but these questions, these words were for her like a blow to all the moral boundaries that she had built for herself. His face was serious, and his voice was soft, but with an ineffable power. He spoke again of her future, of how she might take a more important place in this house, and she felt her chest tighten. It was more than a desire to improve her life, perhaps a call for personal freedom that Jane could not ignore. But she was a servant, and this was not for her. She knew that, however much she felt it, she could not break the rules that governed her life. But in spite of this, a rebellion was awakening in her soul, a rebellion against being merely a servant, against ignoring her feelings. Jane began to ask questions she had never allowed herself to ask before. Why didn't she have the right to a private life? Why did her feelings have to be off limits? Why couldn't she be not only a servant, but also a person with the right to her own emotions? These questions tormented her every day, and the internal conflict became more and more obvious. Jane felt like she needed to change something in her life, no matter how difficult it was. But every time she thought about it, she came up against moral and social boundaries that couldn't be simply broken. She knew that her feelings for Mr. Hartford could not be normal, that they were impossible, that they could ruin her life. But with each passing day, with each conversation with him, she felt more and more that her heart could not resist. She understood that all this had no future, that she could not allow herself to think of him as a man, and not just as a master, but inside her there was growing a need to be not only a servant, but a woman with the right to her own happiness. This conflict between her moral obligations and her own desires became more and more painful. Mr. Hartford, seeing how she had changed, spoke to her again, but this time his words were different from before. He began to talk about her future, about how she could take a more important role in the house, and this proposal sounded like an acknowledgement of her value as a person and not just as a servant. This was the final point of her struggle. At that moment she realized that she could not go back, that she had to either stay in this house and live with this inner conflict, or find the strength within herself to end it all. Every day was like the previous one, routine duties that she carried out with minimal effort, but with each passing year she became increasingly aware that the work of a servant was not limited to physical labor. It was not just labor, it was an endless repetition that penetrated her thoughts, her soul. How long could she continue to work like this without feeling that her life was losing its meaning? A question arose in her mind that she could not ignore. At what price was she paying for her simple labor? She was never free. Her time, her thoughts, her actions, everything was subordinated to the house and its needs. She could not afford to make mistakes. Each day was filled with tasks that did not require thinking, did not leave time for reflection. The tasks became mechanical, and Jane noticed how gradually her life turned into one big chain of actions, each day following the same scenario. She could not remember the last time she managed to tear herself away from her work, when she felt alive and not just a robot performing her duties. She no longer felt the pain of long hours on her feet, of washing dishes, of cleaning the rooms, but one day when she tried to lift a heavy box of provisions, she felt a strong pain in her back. It was not just physical pain, it was a reminder of how she was wearing out. Her body began to remind her that the work she was doing required not only effort, but also sacrifice. Pain was nothing unusual for her, but now she realized that her own body was beginning to suffer from simple work that had once seemed unnoticeable. At that moment she felt how heavy she was becoming and how quickly her youth was passing. She began to feel that they no longer treated her as an equal. Although she did her job perfectly, her position among the servants became increasingly alienated. She felt that her efforts were not appreciated, that her work was part of a system in which no one was valuable. They were all part of a machine that worked without stopping. Jane realized that none of the servants were important. No one mattered. They were all just tools, used until they were useful, and then forgotten. They all lived the same life, doing the same work, but she noticed that with each passing year their eyes grew duller. Perhaps it was because they had lost all hope for change, that they had been doing their jobs for so long that they could no longer imagine a different life. But there was still a sparkle in Jane's eyes. She still believed that her life could be different. But every day she spent in this house took away her strength and hope. She felt her life losing its meaning in this endless routine. All her efforts, all her sacrifices seemed empty. Although she did her job conscientiously, her labor did not bring satisfaction, did not leave a trace. She was not proud of her work. The thought often arose in her head, why am I doing all this? She could not find an answer, because there was no purpose in her life except to survive in this house, continuing to fulfill her role. But survival could not be the only meaning of her existence. At that moment she realized that her work, which had once been a mere routine for her, had become her only guide. She even began to feel her life losing its shape, turning into an endless job from which she could not escape. She could not remember the last time she had felt free, the last time she had allowed herself not to think about her responsibilities, and not to worry about how she would complete the next task. She realized that her work was not just physical effort, but a form of enslavement, a form that kept her within limits that she could not overcome. But as Jane listened to them, she began to realize that this phrase was not just a vital truth, but an excuse. They were all prisoners, and their work was nothing more than a way to survive. These conversations were becoming more and more like an excuse for existence. Jane knew that she could not continue like this, but she could not find the strength to change her life. She understood that her work was just part of this system from which there was no escape. Her body and mind were completely exhausted, but despite her fatigue, the battle in her head did not stop. She understood that her work was an important element of the system, that her absence would cause many problems. But what would happen to her if she stopped working? Jane felt how her work took more and more of her energy every day, but she could not leave everything. She could not give up her work. This was her existence, her place in this house. And despite the fact that her mind and soul were losing strength, She could not allow herself to leave. She could no longer ignore how she was losing herself in this endless routine. She could not continue to serve without realizing that her life had become part of this machine that knew no stopping. And although her body continued to work, her soul began to scream. Jane understood that if she did not change her life, she would finally lose herself. Her work, which had previously been just an obligation, had become her prison. She could not allow herself to be just a tool doing work, and although she did not know how to get out, her inner resistance became her only chance. Jane stands in front of it, adjusting her servant's cap. Her hands tremble slightly as she looks at her reflection, her expression filled with internal conflict. The room is small and simple, with shadows stretching across the walls, symbolizing the emotional weight of her duties. The mirror reflects her as both a servant and a woman caught in a deeper, unspoken struggle. The guests are engaged in conversation, but Jane's eyes are focused elsewhere, lost in thought. She feels disconnected from the life happening around her, her mind consumed by the repetitive nature of her work. The opulent room, with its fine furniture and rich lighting, contrasts sharply with her internal weariness. Jane's face is distant, reflecting the monotonous, dehumanizing cycle of her daily routine. The strain in her posture is evident, and a flicker of discomfort crosses her face. The room around her is bustling with activity, but her focus is entirely on the growing physical toll of her labor. Her hands grip the box tightly, symbolizing how much weight she's carrying, both literally and emotionally. Jane walks among them, but the faces around her are blank, filled with the exhaustion of unceasing work. Each servant appears hollow, their eyes dimmed by years of routine. Jane stands apart, but there is a recognition in her face, a realization that they are all trapped in the same cycle. The grand decor of the mansion contrasts with the souls of those who serve within it, creating a visual tension. In the background, other servants move through their tasks mechanically, not even glancing at her. The kitchen is warm with the glow of the hearth, but Jane's thoughts drift away from the mundane task at hand. Her face reflects internal struggle, torn between the duties she has been conditioned to carry out and the desire for something more. The room is sparsely decorated, with shadows stretching across the walls. Her face is thoughtful, filled with a mix of longing and frustration. Outside the window, the moonlight bathes the garden in soft light, symbolizing the freedom Jane yearns for but feels trapped from ever achieving. The sounds of the bustling house seem distant, while Jane's gaze is empty and tired, focusing on nothing in particular. Her movements are slow and deliberate, but her mind is heavy with thoughts of her stagnant life. The contrast between her physical action and mental exhaustion is palpable in the dim light of the room. The room is dimly lit by the fire, casting shadows on the walls. She looks exhausted, both physically and emotionally, as she contemplates how much of her life has been consumed by the endless cycle of labor. The fireplace symbolizes the warmth and life she yearns for, but the room feels suffocating, with its rich decor and grandeur only serving to highlight her isolation. The mansion feels cold, despite the warmth of the lights. Jane's face is filled with a deep sadness as she contemplates the heavy toll of her work. The long hallway stretching endlessly in front of her represents the ongoing monotony of her life and the distance she feels from any real sense of freedom or self. The room is modest, with shadows cast by a single candle. Jane looks out the window, her eyes filled with thoughts of escape and change, yet she knows she is bound to this life. The image captures her internal conflict between the desire for something more and the harsh reality of her situation. When she first came to work in this house, all the servants were friendly and helpful to each other. But over the years, the atmosphere between them became more tense. Jane began to feel that her inner state, her aspirations for a better life, increasingly separated her from the other servants. In the eyes of her colleagues, there was no longer the same understanding as before. They began to perceive her as a threat, as someone who asked questions that were not supposed to be answered. Colleagues no longer looked at her as an equal, and Jane could not understand why all this had happened. Their interactions became less frequent and their conversations more superficial. They would whisper to each other when she approached, as if they were afraid she might overhear something. It was unpleasant, and although Jane tried to ignore the changes, she couldn't help but notice that her surroundings were changing. Before, they might have discussed minor events in the house or swapped small stories, but now even a simple greeting from her colleagues felt unnecessary and unnecessary. Jane began to wonder what she had done wrong, what had changed in her behavior that had caused her colleagues to distance themselves. Mary was a few years older, and Jane had always looked to her as a mentor, but lately she had noticed Mary becoming distant. The woman who had once given her advice and encouragement now looked at her with displeasure. Jane tried to talk to her, but her attempts were met with a cold response. Mary was no longer the kind, helpful mentor. She had become more withdrawn, avoiding conversation and answering Jane's questions with irritation. This was especially painful because Jane respected her, and the break with her seemed especially painful. Jane felt her relationships with the other servants becoming more strained. Every day in the house brought new little misunderstandings. She began to notice how they began to talk about her behind her back, how they whispered about her behavior, and avoided her more and more often. Words of discontent often flashed through the conversations of colleagues, but no one dared to directly tell her that her presence somehow bothered the others. Jane began to think that perhaps her desire for a better life, her dreams of something more, were beginning to be perceived as a challenge. She tried to obey the rules, to maintain her status as a servant, but she felt how her isolation was becoming more and more obvious. She felt her desire to improve her life, to move beyond her role as a servant, was beginning to become something they could not understand. She tried to establish contact, to talk about something personal, but her words were met with cold looks, or, at best, neutral responses. There was something alien in their eyes, something that did not allow her to feel part of this group. They began to avoid her not only in conversation, but also in work. Jane began to feel that she had lost her role among her colleagues, that she was no longer part of the team for them. Jane stood outside the door, and although she couldn't see their faces, she felt their words cut her deep. They talked about how Jane looked like she wanted to be above her role, and how her desire to improve only got in the way of the overall effort. The words sounded like a death sentence, and although Jane tried not to take them personally, she couldn't shake the feeling that her colleagues no longer saw her as a person, but as a threat. She was shocked that her own aspirations had caused her to be isolated in this house. She came to her when Mary was alone in the kitchen again. Jane asked her to discuss their relationship, asked her to explain what had happened, but Mary responded coldly, not meeting her gaze. She said, "Everything is in its place here. You must not think that your place is more important than anyone else's." These words pierced Jane. In that moment she realized that her own aspirations were the cause of her loneliness. Mary was no longer her friend and mentor. She was part of a system that punished any attempt to step outside her role. She believed that her relationships with her co-workers could be mended, that the internal conflict she felt could be overcome, but each day spent among those who avoided her made her doubt this more and more. Jane knew that her place among the servants had been firmly established, and despite her best efforts, she could not change the way her co-workers perceived her as a threat. She was part of a system, and no matter how hard she tried to transcend it, she remained within the expectations that were placed upon her. Over time, Jane realized that these relationships could not be mended, that she had lost touch with those who had once been close to her. She couldn't change her co-workers, couldn't change their perception of her as a threat. She tried to find a way out, tried to mend relationships, but in essence, she was to blame for her situation. It was a lesson she couldn't escape. Duty to her masters and to society became what defined her life. Over time, she realized that perhaps it wasn't worth trying to change her situation anymore. She was a servant, and this place defined her fate. This relationship had become not just a routine for her, but a heavy burden that she carried daily. She realized that her aspirations were imposed on her, not on her colleagues. She had to understand that her role in this house was that of a servant, and despite all her efforts, this would not change. Jane accepted this, but felt her heart breaking at the thought that she could not become a part of this system, no matter how much she wanted to. At the beginning of her work in the house, when she was just beginning to settle in, she thought that the servants would always support each other. But with each passing month, she increasingly felt how tensions arose between them, how differences in character, views, and even behavior became visible. All this was hidden behind the external facade of friendship and equality, but Jane gradually realized that this appearance was only a shell, behind which dislike and competition were hidden. What began as simple communication over time turned into a battleground for the attention of the masters, for better conditions, for easier duties. And she, like everyone else, found herself drawn into this hidden conflict. Eliza was a respected figure among the servants, and her opinions often influenced the others. But Jane noticed that despite her experience and ability to do her job, Eliza showed no desire to help the newcomers. On the contrary, she began to see Jane as a competitor. Sometimes Jane felt Eliza looking at her with displeasure, evaluating her every move as if waiting for her to make a mistake. They rarely spoke directly, but when they did, Jane sensed the hidden aggression hidden in her words. Despite all Jane's attempts to be polite and tolerant, this tension became more and more palpable. It was as if Eliza could not forgive her for her ambition and desire to be the best. Each of them was focused on their own tasks, trying to do them as well as possible to gain the approval of their masters. But in this desire to stand out, to show their value, they began to forget about supporting each other. The competition became invisible, but its influence was impossible to ignore. Jane noticed how other maids began to check her work, evaluate her actions, as if waiting for the moment when she made a mistake. At some point, Jane realized that even her small victories, such as positive feedback from the masters, began to cause envy in others rather than joy. Every comment made about Jane's work was not taken as constructive criticism, but as a veiled attack. If she did her job too well, it was frowned upon. If she made a mistake, it became a source of ridicule and discussion. One day, after she had completed a task, especially quickly and efficiently, Jane heard one of the maids whisper, "She always strives to be better than others." The words stayed with her, and she could not forget how they affected her self-perception. It was painful. She had always strived to do her best work, but now even that was a cause for judgment. Anna, although relatively new, was already active in various domestic matters, trying to please everyone. At first glance, she seemed kind and open, but Jane soon realized that her behavior concealed a desire to manipulate the situation. Anna often tried to befriend Jane in order to then use her trust for her own purposes. She began to ask Jane about the personal lives of the owners, or tried to find out her opinion of other servants in order to then pass on this information. All this was part of a hidden game that Jane could not fully understand, but felt its tension in the air. These conversations died down as soon as she entered, but the look she met from Eliza was one of hidden contempt. The situation made Jane feel that she was no longer part of the group, that her position among the servants had become precarious. It was the moment when she realized that despite her efforts to be polite and proper, her status among her colleagues was now at risk. She could no longer hide this feeling of alienation and pain. She could no longer believe that working among these people would ever bring her satisfaction. Jane tried to put her personal feelings aside and concentrate on her work, but her relationships with her colleagues continued to erode her inner peace. She began to doubt that her ambitions, her desire to improve her life, could ever be understood by those who were her colleagues. Sometimes it seemed to her that even her best efforts could not break through the wall of alienation that was being built between her and the other servants. Even her successes, which had once brought joy, now seemed bitter to her, because she knew that they only worsened her position among her colleagues. It was a constant internal conflict. She wanted to do her job as best as possible, but she had to deal with the fact that her successes were perceived as a threat to others. Sometimes she tried to ignore the small conflicts that occurred every day, but with each passing month it became more difficult. She felt that an invisible wall was being built between them, and that no amount of effort on her part could break down this barrier. Sometimes, sitting in her small room, Jane wondered if perhaps she would be better off alone if she could escape this painful relationship. But her heart sank at the thought. She knew that even being alone in a house full of other servants would not bring her inner peace. But she could not change her situation. She was a servant, and her position in the house was fixed. She could not escape the competition, envy, and resentment among her colleagues. And although her feelings became more and more confused, she increasingly felt that her role in the house would never change. In this relationship, full of tension, discontent, and latent aggression, she was trapped. Jane realized that her relationship with the maids had become as complicated as theirs was with her. But with each passing day, she felt more and more that her place among them had become not only her duty, but also her prison. She could no longer hide how deeply these difficulties with her colleagues were undermining her inner state. Every day became not only a struggle to fulfill her duties, but also a struggle for her place among those around her. She realized that, despite her aspirations and efforts, she could not be someone else in the eyes of her colleagues. Her place among them remained unchanged, and her inner conflict unresolved. When she first came to this house, everything seemed much simpler. She did her job without thinking about the consequences. But as time went on, every day in this house became a psychological struggle for her. Tasks that once seemed familiar now took away not only her physical energy, but also her mental strength. She began to notice how her perception of the world around her was changing. Bright moments of joy that could once cheer her up now seemed distant and inappropriate to her current state. This inevitable internal crisis became more and more intense. Each new task, each new day seemed to absorb a part of her personality. In this house, she ceased to be a person with her own desires and feelings. Instead, she became simply an instrument for carrying out someone else's instructions. In the evenings, when she was alone in her room, she tried to find time to think, but her thoughts would not fit into her head. She increasingly felt a growing sense of emptiness. The mental fatigue that had long ago begun to settle in her body now seemed to have become a part of her. She realized that she could no longer be sure of her feelings, could not understand who she really was. Every glance in the mirror reminded her that she had lost her identity, that her existence had become only part of the system, part of this huge mechanism. She felt how her inner world was gradually collapsing under the weight of unbearable expectations. But these thoughts about change seemed naive and groundless to her. Questions constantly swirled in her head. Why am I still here? Why do I continue to tolerate this? She tried to answer herself, but the answers were empty and unconvincing. Even her internal monologues began to lose their meaning. Simple work, daily repetition of tasks, no longer brought her satisfaction, and the thoughts that she still could not change her life became unbearable. She felt how her soul was tired of fighting with itself, how her body and mind became allies in the fight against this pressure. She tried to remain neutral, to avoid unnecessary conversations and quarrels, but the internal conflict became more and more obvious with each passing day. She realized that her efforts to become a better servant, to show ambition, only complicated her relationships with her colleagues. Finding herself in the center of incessant pressure, she felt her mental state begin to crumble. When she stood in the kitchen, hearing others whisper about her aspirations, it was like a knife in the heart. These small remarks, full of discontent, made her doubt herself more and more often. Jane began to feel how her own self-confidence was disappearing, and that she had become a stranger even to those with whom she used to share her life. With each passing day, she became more and more withdrawn. In moments of rest, her thoughts would not leave her inner experiences, her worries about the future, and her alienation from her colleagues. In this tense atmosphere, she felt her soul shrinking from the fear that she would never be able to break out of this circle. She began to avoid communication, postponed meetings with colleagues, feeling how each conversation with them deprived her of strength. At times it seemed to her that she could not continue this life, could not be part of the society that was beginning to absorb her. Even a simple greeting from colleagues began to seem burdensome to her. The psychological pressure on Jane increased, and she increasingly felt how her inner world was collapsing. The thought that her life was continuing to pass within these walls, without giving her the slightest chance for freedom, gave her no peace. The endless repetition of the same day, the monotony of her existence became unbearable. She understood that this feeling of internal tension was turning into constant pain, as if her soul could not find rest. This pain did not leave her, and even sleep, when it came, became not a consolation, but another illustration of how her life was going nowhere. She could not forget how hard it was for her to breathe in this house, how she was losing herself with each passing day. Each new day was like a struggle with her own fatigue, with a self-consciousness that was increasingly consuming her. Simple tasks like washing dishes or cleaning the rooms were no longer just work. They became a reflection of her inner state, mechanical, meaningless, hopeless. Jane could no longer tell herself that she was doing something important. She felt how her emotional exhaustion affected her every step, and how this inner impotence was taking over her more and more. Even the daily routine now seemed impossible, and she began to doubt whether she would be able to continue this life at all. The stress, the psychological pressure, the thought of the impossibility of change, all of this began to cause her constant anxiety. Every time she met the gaze of her masters or other servants, her heart began to beat faster, as if she felt threatened by even the simplest interactions. She felt her own feelings becoming unstable, as if she was losing touch with herself. She began to avoid direct conversations, trying to maintain distance, but even this did not give her peace. The thought continued to swirl in her head. Can I continue to live like this? Jane began to notice how her anxiety manifested itself in physical symptoms: headaches, insomnia, even weakness in her body. Her eyes reflected fatigue, not just physical, but mental as well. She could no longer hide from herself that life in this house had become torture for her. She tried to find ways to relax, But even in moments of rest, her mind continued to spin the same thing. What will happen next? How can I continue? This internal conflict became her constant companion. She could no longer perform her duties with the same dedication as before. Everything she did seemed empty and meaningless to her. There was no room in her head for ordinary joys, even for simple successes. All she cared about was how to avoid internal pain, how to hide her emotions from others. She felt like she was losing control over her life, and despite her efforts, she could not break out of this vicious circle. Jane realized that the only way out was to admit her vulnerability and admit that she could no longer be the way she had been before. There was a lot of work, and she tried to do it as best as she could, but there was still a feeling of emptiness. At some point she realized that she could no longer stay in this house and live by someone else's rules, serve only to support someone else's interests. She began to notice how everything around her seemed frozen, a walking mechanism, performing its duties, without thinking about the future or its role in this house. In these moments she began to realize that her life could not remain like this. She looked for a way out, looked for a way to change her fate. The thought began to creep into her that there could be more to her life than just being a servant. But with every new thought of change came a doubt. What if these are just dreams that will never come true? Jane knew that any forward movement would require great effort and inner determination. She knew that her ambition and desire for the best were not welcome in this house, and that she was surrounded by people who might not understand her aspirations. Thoughts swirled in her head that she wanted something more, but fear and uncertainty paralyzed her, making her doubt the correctness of her desires. The sun was shining brightly, but to her the light seemed dim, as if everything around her was painted in shades of gray. There were many flowers in the garden, and the air was fresh, but it all seemed too far away and unattainable for her. Walking was like something forbidden to her, like something she was not allowed to do. She felt cut off from it all, but it was at that moment that she first felt that there could be something more to her life than just work. Every walk, every glance at the green expanse of the garden reminded her that life could be different. She felt a slight awakening, an inner strength that began to move inside her. The walk in the garden became a catalyst for her reflection. She decided that she could not continue to live as she had before. The feeling that her life could be different did not leave her. She began to imagine a picture, being free, having a choice, and not just following a predetermined path. But this thought collided with her fears. What if she could not change her life? What if all this was just a dream that would never come true? Despite her fear, Jane began to feel a desire to fight for a new life awakening inside her. She knew that change would require courage, but she was willing to try, no matter how scary it was. She realized that fear was undoubtedly one of the main factors holding her back. She was afraid that if she took a step forward, she would be faced with misunderstanding and judgment from others. She felt that her dreams of a better life were facing an invisible wall that was difficult to overcome. But at that moment, Jane decided that she could not wait any longer, that her life could not remain as it was. She made the decision that she would start looking for opportunities that could allow her to get out of this trap. This decision was an important step forward, and although her inner world was still full of doubts, Jane felt that this step was necessary. She began to observe how the other servants interacted with their masters, how they conducted their conversations, how they made decisions. She began to look for opportunities for herself. Jane realized that she didn't necessarily have to look for a path that would lead to immediate success, but simply to take action. She decided that she had to be prepared to perhaps take on more responsibility than she was usually given. She might need to act more decisively than she had ever thought possible, That determination became the key to moving forward. She could still feel the questions in her head. What if you're wrong? Or what if you can't change your life? But with each day, with each effort, her inner voice grew stronger. Jane began to realize that she could control her own life. She began to look for opportunities that could take her beyond this house, beyond the world she was accustomed to. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that a real step forward would require not only effort, but also personal sacrifice. She had to leave a lot behind in order to move forward, and although her doubts continued to torment her, she felt that she had to go beyond the familiar. It was something new for her, talking openly with someone who could share her experiences. She was sitting in the kitchen, nervously picking at her spoon in her cup, when one of the servants, Lisa, with whom Jane had not spoken very often before, began talking to her about how she, too, had once decided to change her life. Lisa shared how she had been able to get a job in a more prestigious place thanks to her connections with the right people. For Jane, this conversation was a turning point. She realized that there was a possibility for change, and it inspired her. She began actively looking for ways that could lead her to change her situation. There were many different options in her thoughts. Perhaps she should leave home, look for a job elsewhere, or do something new. These thoughts began to fill her day with meaning. Although doubts did not disappear, she now had a goal, at least try to change her life. She was prepared for the fact that her path would not be easy, but she felt that change was necessary. She began to think about every step, every movement that could bring her closer to a new life. She could no longer afford to be just a servant in a house. She made a decision. She would find her way, despite the obstacles, despite the fears and doubts. And although the changes might be slow and difficult, she felt that she was taking steps forward, that her life was now filled with new meaning. For the first time in a long time, hope was born in her heart. Hope for the future, for something more, for a life beyond this confined role that had once seemed inevitable. The women who worked as servants seemed to be bound by an invisible web of strict moral and social expectations. They were expected not only to be good workers, but also women who lived up to ideals of modesty, submissiveness, and silent tolerance. Jane had never considered how these expectations shaped the lives of her colleagues until she came face to face with them. These women with whom she shared her labor turned out to be far more complex individuals than they first appeared. Their lives were multi-layered and full of hidden tensions, and Jane began to realize how deeply social norms affected their daily struggles. Mary, the head maid, for example, always remained reserved, as if she carried an invisible burden. She was an authority among the maids, but Jane noticed that her cold demeanor concealed loneliness. Mary was a woman who was used to not showing her feelings, who held back her emotions and thoughts so as not to appear weak. For her, being a female servant was a real challenge. She was forced not only to do her job, but also to adhere to the role that was expected of her in this society. This realization was an important lesson for Jane. The women in the house were not only servants, but also prisoners of their roles, and their lives were much more difficult than she could have imagined. These were women who, despite their role as servants, had a strong inner sense of self-worth. They did not accept the status that was assigned to them, and despite their inferior social role, they sought to live life on their own terms. These women, like Anne, sometimes seemed like complete enigmas to Jane. Anne, for example, was young, energetic, with incredible stamina and independence. But Jane noticed that her desire for independence was also the cause of many problems. She often came into conflict with other servants, raising issues that no one was comfortable with. She had a defiant look in her eyes. She did not try to please others, and this character trait made her the subject of discussion and criticism. This division became more apparent as Jane began to observe the lives of her coworkers more closely. She saw how one group of women, including Mary, put on a veneer of harmony and submission, doing their jobs with minimal complaints. They did not protest, they simply went about their duties in silence. But Jane also noticed how another group of women, including Anna, began to openly express discontent. They discussed the inequalities in the home, believing them to be unfair. These women began to form small groups in which they discussed how they could change their lives. Jane felt that her own position was also being challenged in these discussions, and she began to understand how important the choices each woman made were. She had a feeling that her life could be different if she decided to step out of her role as a servant. But at the same time, she felt the internal conflict between the desire for change and the fear of it gradually devour her strength. The thought kept popping into her head. Can I be like Anna? Can I stop pleasing others and start living for myself? But at the same time, her instinct told her that such a change would be associated with great risks. Jane could not imagine that her own colleagues would perceive her as a woman who broke the rules, and the consequences of such a step could be catastrophic. There was something more subtle that Jane sensed as she watched the relationships among the female servants. Despite their differences, they all faced the same hardships and hidden abuse from their masters. The women of the house were required not only to work, but also to maintain an outward calm, even when hurricanes of emotion raged within. Jane began to understand how this weighed on their psyches, how hidden hatred and disappointment hid beneath a thin layer of politeness and restraint. At some point, she realized that while women might be competitors, they were also in the same boat, and their common experiences united them far more than their differences. She noticed how their relationship was becoming increasingly superficial. When they met in the hallways or the kitchen, their conversations did not touch on personal topics, but only on work matters. Even Jane's attempts to start a conversation about how they could change their lives were not met with a response. The women were absorbed in their own problems, and many did not even want to hear about change. For them, this life was the norm, and they preferred to maintain the status quo because the fear of the unknown was stronger than the desire to change. She could not forget the conversations she had with women who were seeking change. Jane knew that her own desire to change her life was not unique, but she also felt that her life and her work were not recognized. Women servants were bound by an invisible network that did not allow them to break out of their social status. Jane realized that despite all her aspirations and desires, she was still part of a system in which women were forced to choose between submission and struggle, but still remained in the role of servant. She realized that women who were able to unite, even in the face of harsh social realities, became stronger. Jane began to think that if she could find support among other women, if they could start acting together, then their struggle for better living conditions might have a chance of success. She realized that her inner strength, her ambitions, and her desire to change her life could be much stronger if she united with those who shared her aspirations. She could no longer remain an observer, passively watching other women change their lives. Jane decided that if she wanted to change her future, she needed to start seeking support among her colleagues. The women in the house were not just servants, they were bound together by a common goal to survive in this cruel world. And now Jane understood that if she was going to fight for her rights, for her life, she needed to act not alone, but with those who were ready to go with her. This was a decisive discovery for her. But over time, As she began to understand her own feelings and place in the world, she began to notice how much male figures influenced everything around her. The men in the home, from the masters to the servants, played a major role not only in organizing the work, but in shaping the moral standards, expectations, and even the dynamics of the relationships between everyone. It was difficult for her to understand how the men viewed the women in the household. How did they see her? How did they view her work? Jane could not help but notice that their views of the female servant were full of hidden control and oppression, despite their outwardly polite attitudes. She felt these views invisibly weighing on her, creating an atmosphere in which she, although not always consciously aware of it, was always in the background. Despite his kindness and attentiveness, his figure was always imperious and unquestionable. He was a man whose opinion was always taken as truth, and his words were not just recommendations, but demands that had to be fulfilled. Jane felt how his presence overshadowed her own I, how his simple silence forced her to hide her own thoughts and emotions. Every word, every decision of his seemed to her an omen that could not be argued with. But at some point she began to realize that his power was not as immutable as she had previously thought. Meetings with him became more and more tense, and despite her affection, Jane increasingly began to wonder if he was using her for his own interests. Among them was the cook, a middle-aged man she often encountered in the kitchen. He was stern but fair, and his instructions, while harsh, were always genuinely caring. He reminded Jane of the importance of discipline and order, but his approach was far from how she was accustomed to perceiving the men in the house. The cook was a man who knew his place, but was always willing to support the other servants if they needed help. For Jane, this man was an example of how to be strong without being oppressive. But despite his kindness, he also reminded her of the cruelty of the male role in the home, how men, even good ones, were still the ones who dictated the rules under which women were not allowed to be independent. Despite her best efforts to be dignified and to follow all the rules and regulations, she could not escape the fact that men, especially her masters, still looked at her as a tool to perform their tasks. This realization gradually began to erode her ideas about her place in the house. She realized that the role of a woman servant would always be limited by what other people, especially men, allowed her to do. This realization became a heavy burden for her, especially when she saw how other women among the servants were ready to submit to this system without question. Jane increasingly felt that her strength was dwindling, and she could no longer exist in such a role without feeling a complete lack of choice. One such man was the senior steward, with whom Jane rarely interacted, but when she did, he always spoke to her condescendingly, as if she were a child. Despite his important position in the house, he often emphasized her place among the servants, making her feel humiliated. He spoke to her as an object, not as a person. His gaze was always cold and arrogant, which further emphasized her dependence. Jane knew that she could not escape this social trap, but in her heart a growing determination was born to prove to herself and to others that her value was not limited to her duties. These were men like the butler who, despite his position, always treated the servants with respect. He never showed his superiority, did not use his authority to suppress, and his attitude towards Jane was always polite and fair. He was a man who understood that, despite their position, they all played the same role in the house, and he never tried to stand out among them. In his eyes, Jane was not just a servant, but part of a system that needed to be respected. This man became an example for her that it was possible to be strong while remaining polite and fair. He taught Jane an important lesson. True strength does not come from dominance, but from the ability to find a balance between power and respect. These men, despite their different attitudes toward her, always remained the main figures with whom she had to deal. She understood that their influence was not only external, but also internal, on her perception of herself, on her views of the world. Men not only determined her duties, but also secretly dictated her place in the house and in life. This realization was difficult for Jane because she understood that her ability to change depended on how much she was willing to fight this system. She felt that she was finding more and more strength in herself, but at the same time her struggle was becoming more and more difficult. She realized that men can be different, from domineering and cold to fair and caring. She began to look for those moments when men managed to show humanity, and this became an important revelation for her. She began to understand that not all the men in the house were the same. Some of them showed respect for women, even if they could not change their role in the house. Jane decided that she had to learn to see them not only as executors of others' will, but also people whose actions could serve as an example for her in the struggle for a better life. She could no longer ignore the fact that she was influenced by their views, their power, their social status. But now she understood that her own power was not limited only by what men expected of her. She understood that her place in this house depended not only on their will, but also on how she perceived her own dignity. It was a revelation that gave her the strength to move forward. She knew that in order to change her life, she had to learn to control not only her actions, but also her thoughts. She realized that her attitude toward them and their attitude toward her needed to be reconsidered. She began to see that her own strength lay in learning to balance respect and independence, inner strength and respect for others. This balance became the key to finding a way forward for her, no matter how the men in the house perceived her. She could no longer accept that her role was predetermined, that her future was tied only to carrying out other people's orders. Constantly confronted with the harsh reality of her work, she began to wonder what she was doing with her life. She realized that every day her self-esteem was being destroyed, that she was losing more and more of her individuality, and although she knew that it was dangerous to rebel against the order in the house, she could no longer remain indifferent. This thought threatened her peace, and despite all her doubts, she began to feel how the rebellion was growing inside her, how the desire for something more was becoming inevitable. She could no longer play the role of a silent servant who did her job without asking questions. She realized that her desire for a better life had become her inner protest. It was not just a desire for better conditions or an increase in her role in the house, but a protest against the very system that oppressed her. This protest was in her eyes, in her gestures, in the way she began to treat her duties. More and more often, she wondered why she should stay in this place if she could not find her place in life. This inner protest was like a silent destruction of her inner world, like a fight with herself and with those who did not allow her to move forward. She felt her inner protest growing, her thoughts increasingly filled with hatred for the system she lived in. She could no longer hide her weariness and disappointment, and this protest became open. When she was in the kitchen, preparing dinner for the masters, she noticed how the other servants were paying attention to her actions. They tried not to meet her gaze, as if they knew that something important and dangerous was happening in her soul. They felt her mood changing, and they understood that Jane no longer agreed to be part of this system that oppressed her. She began to speak openly to the other servants about her discontent. Though these conversations were cautious, hidden, they still reflected her growing determination. She tried to convince her colleagues that they deserved more, that their lives could be different, but her words fell on deaf ears. Most of the servants were too intimidated to share her views. They were used to keeping quiet, to doing their jobs without question. But despite this, Jane felt that she could not remain silent. She could no longer hide her protest, even if it meant becoming a loner among the other servants. She stood in the room, alone among the empty chairs and furniture, and realized that she had to do something drastic. This moment was a turning point for her. She realized that her life could not remain as it was. The protest that had been growing inside her was now ready to burst out. Jane decided that she would no longer remain silent, that she had to show her inner strength and speak out against what was oppressing her. A fire had appeared in her soul that could no longer be extinguished. At first, it was small actions. She stopped fulfilling her duties with the same dedication as before, began to ask questions that she had previously avoided. Jane knew that her actions could lead to consequences, but an inner voice told her that she could no longer continue this life of silent submission. Each day, her protest became more and more obvious. She realized that her fight was not only for a better life, but also for her own dignity. She began to understand that real protest begins within, and that her actions must be conscious and purposeful. She began to notice how her attitude toward her began to change, how her colleagues began to avoid her. She saw how they began to regard her with fear, with distrust, as if she were a threat to their normal order. But this fear, this refusal to understand her aspirations, only strengthened her resolve. She began to feel that her protest was not only her own act of struggle, but also an act against the entire system. She began to sense that her fight for a better future could be the spark that would awaken others, even if it meant she had to endure loneliness and alienation. This protest involved all the women and all the servants in the house. She began to notice how some of the female servants began to look at her differently, as if they saw her not just as a servant, but as a woman who was willing to fight for herself. This attention became a kind of confirmation for her that her protest mattered. She realized that her actions could inspire others, that she could be a catalyst for change, even if she didn't yet fully understand how that change would occur. She began to openly discuss with other women her dream of a better life, the idea that they too could transcend their roles. She talked about how they didn't have to be slaves to the system, that they could find ways to change. These conversations became more frequent, and Jane began to notice how some of the women were beginning to think about how they could change their lives. Although they were hesitant to act, Jane felt that her protest had been worthwhile. She began to realize that her desire for a better life was not just her own, but also the beginning of change in the group. She realized that the changes she craved could not happen quickly, that they would take time, effort, and support. But she also realized that this protest was the first step toward a better life, a life in which she would no longer be silent, in which her voice would be heard. Jane felt that she was ready to fight for her rights, that she was ready to take risks in order to change her destiny. And despite all the doubts, despite the fears, Jane began to realize that this protest was not just a rejection of oppression, but a path to her personal freedom. Time passed, but her life remained monotonous and predictable. She could not shake the feeling that she had a long way to go before she could change her destiny. But despite the constant difficulties, her soul was not yet consumed by despair. A spark of hope burned in her chest, which grew brighter with each passing day. She believed that difficulties were not the end, but simply a stage that must be passed in order to come to something better. Despite all the obstacles, she understood that only through struggle can change be achieved. But an internal conflict continued to torment her. How to find the strength to continue when everything around seemed so immutable and unchangeable. The morning began with work in the kitchen, where Jane performed her duties over and over again, sometimes without even thinking about them. But despite her fatigue and the fact that she was faced with routine again and again, Her perspective began to change. She no longer performed her duties with the same indifference. Every time she washed the dishes or prepared food, thoughts of change, of possibilities sounded in her head. More and more often she wondered why she had to be condemned to such a life. She understood that hoping for an accidental improvement made no sense. Hope lay in finding a way to change, and perhaps she herself was the key to this change. It was not only physical, but emotional exhaustion. Jane tried to understand why they did not strive for more, why everyone was content with what they had been given. In her eyes, it seemed unbearable, as if everyone had simply resigned themselves to the fact that life had placed them in a certain frame. However, Jane felt that her own fate could not be like this. She did not want to reconcile herself to the fact that others accepted this order of things as inevitable. It was hard for her, but she felt a protest flaring up inside her. This protest was her sincere hope for a better future. Even though she could not talk about it with her colleagues, inside her there was a conviction that the world should not be like this. The silence in the house was unusual, and at that moment, for the first time, she felt that she had time to think about her future. The inner protest that she had been suppressing for a long time now broke out. She thought that the only way to achieve change was to find the strength to fight. All this time she had been absorbed by worries, tasks, but now she realized that she had the right to a future. At that moment she realized that she could no longer wait for her life to be determined by other people's decisions. She had to take a step forward, and despite the fear, she was ready to fight for her dreams. She thought about starting with small steps, changing her attitude to her work, to herself, to others. She decided that she had to look for ways to improve conditions for herself and the other servants. Every day when she went to the kitchen or cleaned the rooms, she set herself the task of not just doing the job, but doing it with an approach that would change her perception. She tried to bring not only routine, but also meaning to her work. Sometimes it seemed to her that she could not cope with it, but with each new day, with each new step, she felt that her efforts were beginning to bring results. Hope and the struggle for a better future became her inner engines. Jane increasingly wondered if she was wasting her energy on dreams that might never come true. She felt that change required not only courage, but also a willingness to make sacrifices. It was difficult. Every step towards a better future seemed burdensome. She began to doubt that all her efforts would lead to success. But in these doubts she felt a strange sensation. The more she doubted, the stronger her determination became. Jane began to understand that doubts and difficulties were not obstacles, but only part of the path she had to take. Her hope was now growing stronger, and each step she took, despite her fears, strengthened her faith that the future would be different. She realized that in order to change her life, she needed to take on more responsibility, be ready to solve complex problems. It was like an internal awakening when she realized that life would not wait for her. Change requires action, and she had to be ready for it. She began to look at her work and responsibilities differently, trying to approach them not as a routine, but as an opportunity for growth and development. This realization was an important step forward. She realized that the fight for a better future begins with her internal changes. She began talking to other servants, discussing the possibility of improving their conditions. Although her colleagues were not ready for radical changes, she felt that her words mattered. She realized that she herself had to become an example of change, to inspire others to seek change. However, her internal conflict became increasingly obvious. How to live in a society that is not ready for change, how to live among people who are still afraid to step outside the established order. These questions tormented Jane, but deep down she knew that if she did not begin to fight for change, no one would do it for her. She understood that her efforts should not be just dreams, but concrete steps. She began to plan her next step, preparing to do something important. She decided that she would work on herself to strive to be not only a better servant, but also a better person. It was a moment of truth when she realized that her future life depended on how strong she was willing to be. The hope for a better future became her inner source of strength, and now she felt that her efforts would not be in vain. She began to realize that her hope for a better future was not just a dream, but a reality that she had to fight for. She realized that the difficulties she faced were part of her growth. With each new step, her faith in herself grew stronger, and she realized that change is not a quick process, but every day, every choice she makes brings her closer to her goal. Jane not only hoped for a better future, but now she was actively moving towards it without deviating from her path. The servant of the house was her role, and she tried to do it to the best of her ability. But with each passing day, it became more and more obvious to her that her work was not always appreciated. There was a lot of work, and she did it as best she could, but something inside her began to change. She began to understand that her work, like the work of the other women in the house, was not valued as it deserved. She felt her own self-respect gradually fading, and this awareness increasingly tormented her soul. More and more, the thought arose that work should be appreciated, that her efforts should be recognized, but how could this be done if there was still a system in the house that ignored the servants and their contribution? Men, even those who did less difficult tasks, often received recognition and respect. Their work, even if it was not as important, was surrounded by an aura of importance. On the other hand, women like herself, despite doing much more difficult and physically exhausting work, received no words of gratitude or recognition. This realization became a source of inner pain and discontent for Jane. She could not understand why her efforts were not appreciated, why her work, although necessary for the normal functioning of the house, always went unnoticed. It was unfair, and Jane could no longer ignore this injustice. Despite their hard work, they received nothing in return, no recognition, no respect. Sometimes they did their work with the same enthusiasm as before, but on the faces of these women you could see traces of fatigue, not only physical, but also mental. Jane realized that the problem was not only that their work was not appreciated, but that there was a culture in the house in which servants were invisible. They did their job, and their job was to remain in the shadows. Jane could not understand why the system continued to work this way, and it became increasingly frustrating to her. She began to think that perhaps it was time for this order to be broken, so that the servant's work could finally be appreciated. She stood at the stove, preparing another dish, and realized that her efforts were going unnoticed, as were the efforts of her colleagues. She tried to do her job as best as she could, but in response she received only silence and disdain. At that moment she realized that if she wanted her work to be recognized, she needed to start talking about it. But how? How could she convey to everyone that they too deserved respect? She felt that this was not just her personal problem, but the problem of all the women among the servants. Respect for their work was something they all deserved, but for this to happen, something had to change in the relationships within the house. They began to discuss how things could be changed, how their work could be recognized. The conversations were cautious, but each day Jane felt her words begin to resonate. The women began to think that they deserved more. They discussed how they could change what was accepted as the norm. It was not an easy task, but Jane felt that she was not alone. With each conversation, her own discontent became more determined. She realized that if she wanted to make a difference, she had to be willing to lead others. She had to be the one who opened the doors to respect for work, who began to change the attitudes of servants in the house. Many were not ready to accept that their work should be appreciated. They believed that it was simply part of their fate, that their place was to be invisible and to work without gratitude. Jane felt her protest colliding with this indifference, and it was difficult. She tried to discuss these problems with her colleagues, but most of them responded that she had to accept it and continue working as always. They did not believe that anything could change, but Jane knew that she could not continue to tolerate injustice. She could no longer remain silent, could no longer accept the fact that her efforts were going unnoticed. The internal protest grew, and she realized that in order for her work to be recognized, she had to start acting. She approached Mr. Hartford when he was alone and began to talk about how her work and the work of the other female servants was not appreciated. Mr. Hartford listened, but his answer was cold and unconvincing. He said that the servants' work was their duty, and they should not expect gratitude for what they did. His words were like a nice shower, but Jane did not give in. She realized that in this house, respect for work did not come easy. Her fight was just beginning. She decided that she would not accept her efforts going unnoticed. She began to do her work more resolutely, doing it not only for herself, but for all the servants, to show that their work was important. She also began to express her opinions on how the relationships within the house could be changed, how recognition could be achieved for everyone. The women among the servants began to look at her differently. They became inspired by her determination and were ready to take action. The women among the servants began to show interest in her ideas. They discussed how to gain more respect and recognition, how to fight for their rights. Jane became a leader among the women servants, and her efforts began to bear fruit. She felt how her words and actions began to change the atmosphere in the house, how respect for work began to become part of their struggle. The internal conflict and doubts that had long tormented her began to subside. Jane understood that the struggle for respect for work was not over, but she felt that the first step had been taken. She realized that her efforts, her struggle, her desire for change were important not only to her, but to all the women in the house. It was not just a desire to be appreciated, it was a desire to be heard. Jane realized that respect for work begins with respect for oneself. And although the path to change was long, she knew that she had taken the first step that would change her life and the lives of her colleagues. But with each passing day, her dream became more complex and frightening. She realized that life outside the home was not just freedom, but a completely new world, full of unknowns, full of threats and opportunities that she had not yet encountered. Everything that surrounded her seemed safe, familiar, even if it was a prison. But the more she thought about the future, the more determined she became. She felt that her desire for a new life was part of her being. It was more than just a desire to change her place of work or environment. It was a desire to restore her dignity, to be free from everything that limited her at home. Jane began to wonder how she could ever leave this house. How would she live in a world where she was not seen as a servant, as a shadow of her masters and their families? How would she exist among people who did not see her through the prism of their work? These questions began to torment her. She understood that being free meant not only getting rid of oppression, but also learning to live by her own rules, making choices for which she would be responsible. It was scary, and although her dream of a free life was vivid, she could not shake off the feeling of uncertainty that hung over her. The women she spoke to did not share her ambitions. They looked at her with bewilderment and some pity, as if she were naive. For them, home was not just a place of work, but a part of their lives. They could not imagine going beyond what had long been familiar. Even Anne, who had always been independent, now seemed more attached to the house than Jane. These conversations left her feeling lonely. She realized that if she wanted to change her life, she would have to do it alone. She thought about the world that existed outside the walls of this house, about people who didn't have the same limitations as her. But that life was so foreign, so distant, that she had a hard time imagining how to bridge the gap. Even if she left this house, how could she be part of that world? She didn't know what to do with this feeling, with the barriers that stood between her and her dream. She was beginning to feel like the very reality of that desire seemed heavy, almost impossible. It was not just a physical departure, but a departure from old habits, from her old responsibilities, from the attitude that had been forced upon her in this house. It was not only a release from work, but a release from everything she had known. She realized that her life in this house was not only physically limited, but also psychologically. She could not simply go out and start a new life, as if it were simply a move to another place. She had to change her view of herself, her value and role in this world, and to do this she had to completely transform her inner state. She realized that it was important for her not just to leave the place that oppressed her, but to build a new life based on her own desires and needs. But the more she thought about it, the more questions arose. Where to start? Where to find the strength for this? The inner fear that her dream might be unattainable squeezed her heart. But at some point she realized that despite all these questions, she could no longer live the way she had before. In her soul there was not only anxiety, but also a strong desire for change. She realized that for her, life outside the home would mean not only freedom, but also responsibility.